I'm your guide today, a science communicator who fell in love with fossils the first time I pressed my palm to a rock that still remembered ripples made 500 million years ago. We'll walk across shallow sea floors from 575 to 541 million years ago, when the world's softest revolution took place. Before shells, before teeth, before anything with a face, the oceans were quilted with living blankets, broad ovals ribbed like mattresses, fern-like fronds that looked planted but weren't plants, and circular discs arranged in three-armed spirals. They were strange, silent, and astonishingly successful. Scientists call them the Ediacaran biota, and they mark the first time complex life covered Earth like a landscape without jaws, eyes, or bones. To understand them, we have to unlearn what an animal looks like. Picture a tidal flat after a long storm. Microbes have glued the sand into a slick mat. On that sticky canvas, bodies spread out like throw rugs harvesting faint light and nutrients. A few rose into feathery fronds, tall as a person's arm, fractal in design, branching upon branching so that gentle currents brushed enormous surface area. Others lay low, their rib modules inflating and deflating like air mattresses. These forms did not scurry, bite, or burrow much. They absorbed, filtered, and hovered on carpets of life. I first learned to see them on a wind-whipped headland in Newfoundland called Mistaken Point. There, ash from a volcanic cloud fell on a living seafloor and made a stone snapshot. My mentor, Dr. Lena Ortiz, traced a fingertip along a leafy imprint called Charnia and said, "Don't look for a face, look for the rhythm." Once I stopped hunting for eyes and mouths, the rock bloomed with patterns. Fronds arranged like a meadow, ovals aligned by currents, clusters that hinted at reproduction. Beside us, a young wildlife artist named Maya sketched in quiet frustration. She could capture feathers and fur, but these quilts baffled her. That was the point. Lena whispered. The Ediacaran teaches humility before it teaches identification. What made this world possible? Oxygen had risen just enough to let bigger bodies pay their metabolic bills, and microbial mats paved the seafloor like Velcro, stabilizing sediments so soft creatures could rest without sinking. Preservation was a lucky partnership between biology and geology. When a storm or ashfall buried a mat-bound surface, minerals cast the upper skin of a body a death mask so the negative of a life lingered. That's why the Ediacaran feels both vivid and ghostly, as if we're reading a diary written in impressions. Not everything about these organisms is agreed upon, and uncertainty is a gift. Some, like Charnia and Fractophysis, had fractal branching that suggests feeding by drawing molecules from passing water. Broad ovals, such as Dickinsonia, grew by adding ribs at one end, a conveyor belt of new tissue that sometimes left faint drag marks as they crept across microbial carpets. In Russia's White Sea, the slug-like Kimberella raked the mats, leaving feeding scratches that looked like someone combed wet hair with a plastic pick. Elsewhere, a pinwheel named Tribershetium likely redirected currents toward its center. A living eddy engineered without eyes or limbs. When we camped above the cliffs, Lena admitted a fear you don't often hear at conferences. That she might never be certain where on the tree of life many of these beings belong. Animal, alga, a lost branch with no living heirs. Uncertainty had drained Maya too. Her last gallery show felt forced. Her sketches of modern wildlife a little dishonest, more habit than discovery. The fossils, paradoxically, made space for honesty. You can draw what you see without pretending you know more than you do, Lena told her over a stove that smelled of tea and seawater. In the morning, we tiptoed literally, in socks onto a bedding plane guarded by rangers and community stewards. We counted Fractophysis spread like fallen fronds, and Lena showed how their sizes clustered, hinting reproduction by both drifting propagules and clonal expansion along the mat. Patterns can tell stories even when heads and legs are missing. As the tide rose, Maya tried a new style. No eyes, no mouths, only structure and flow. She smiled for the first time in months. The lesson of part 1 is simple. When the living world looks unfamiliar, start with the pattern and the process, and let the categories catch up later. Later that day, we unrolled a cast from South Australia's Ediacaran Hills, where sheet-like bodies called Dickinsonia lie like drop doormats. Some show a split down the middle, others a glide symmetry, where left and right are offset like bricks. Under certain lenses you can see matte textures around them, a reminder that these creatures lived on land because of microbial carpeting. The mat fed them, anchored them, and helped preserve them. Even the best casts are only upper surfaces, a thin biography of a vanished body too. On a rainy evening back at camp, Maya asked the question many of us circle for years: were these blankets actually animals? Lena warmed her hands over the stove and answered like a field scientist, with evidence and humility. Some Ediacaran forms probably were animals, she said. A line of research pulled fatty molecules, cholesterol, from the film that outlines Dickinsonia, a clue that at least this ribbed oval processed fats the way animals do. At the same time, other quilted forms may represent branches that do not survive into the modern day. The tree of life is not a ladder. It's a forest where many trails end at clearings. Maya nodded and drew a Dickinsonia inching across a mat, each rib added at the rear like new planks on a dock. Then she sketched Cambrian with a soft, rasping mouth, lifting faint comb marks as it grazed. She had spent months drawing predators. Now she was learning to draw metabolism, surface area, and flow. The Ediacaran in a parade of monsters. It's a lesson in how bodies can solve physics with very little oxygen and almost no hard parts. The next day, we flew in our minds across the old supercontinent to Russia's White Sea, where slabs preserve a richer cast. Here, body fossils lie beside movement and feeding traces. Shallow grooves arc away from Dickinsonia like the ghost of a slow shuffle. Elsewhere, Cambrian's scratch marks overlap in patches that look like harvested gardens. When you see a scratch pattern, said Lena, you're watching behavior, not just anatomy. And behavior is where evolution often speaks most clearly. From they return to a creature with 3 radiating arms named Triberchedium. Engineers and paleontologists ran fluid simulations that showed currents being redirected toward its center, as if a living pinwheel guided food to a mouth that left no trace. Fronds, such as Charnia and the log-shaped Fractificus, solved the same problem by branching like lightning, building more surface to exchange molecules. These strategies were elegant, slow, and communal. Sea floors looked more like meadows than hunting grounds, yet change was coming. Across the Ediacaran, we can track 3 broad communities. The Avalon assemblage, including Mistaken Point, is the oldest and deepest, dominated by fronds fixed to the seafloor. The White Sea assemblage shows greater diversity and more movement, including grazers like Cambrian. By the time we reach the Nama assemblage in Namibia and elsewhere, tube dwellers and reef builders such as Cludina appear, and the first clear bites show up as tiny drill holes in their tubes. Something, somewhere, was learning to prey on hard parts. That realization landed hard on Maya. She had come here to rest from the drumbeat of chase scenes and apex predators that fill so much wildlife storytelling. But the story of life is not a march from gentle to violent. It's a dialogue between energy and structure. When oxygen and nutrients allow larger surfaces, bodies sprawl like quilts. When grazers arrive, mats are torn up, sediments loosen, and burrowers gain an edge. Later, when skeletons become affordable, shells bloom. The Ediacaran sits right before that geothermal budget increase. A dawn when biology could spend a little more, but not yet on bone, at a community center near the cliffs. We listened as a local guide named Aden spoke about stewardship. Rangers protect the fossil surfaces with rules as simple as socks and as firm as permits, because a single careless boot can erase an entire organism. Aden lost work in the fishery years ago and now tells visitors why these rocks matter. His voice carried the cadence of weather and waiting. People think the past is gone, he said, but the past is fragile and lives under our feet. Maya asked to draw his hands holding a plaster cast, the old ocean resting on his palms. That evening, we spread casts and photos across the table and tried to arrange them like a timeline you could walk. First the deep meadows of Avalon, all fronds and quilts, then the livelier gardens of the White Sea, with grazers crossing the mats. Finally the Namas reefs and early shells, with the first drill holes like punctuation marks. Even without bones, the plot had acts and turns. Lena added one more thread. Spatial studies at Mistaken Point show how some fronds, such as fractificus, clustered in patterns that imply two kinds of reproduction, far-drifting propagules that seeded new patches, and local cloning that spread like the runners of strawberries. In other words, these organisms colonize space the way plants and corals do today, despite belonging to neither. Once you see that, the bedding planes stop being static pictures and start to feel like snapshots of living neighborhoods. Maya redrew her fronds with little arrows to mark imagined currents, and she left space for the invisible. She left room for water. Next we ask why many quilts vanished, what changed in the water, the sediment, and the rules of survival. The end of the Ediacaran wasn't a single curtain drop but a set of slow building pressures that rewrote the seafloor. Imagine a stadium crowd that has been sitting quietly on picnic blankets. Now picture some people standing, then weaving between blankets, then rolling the blankets up. That is what burrowing and grazing can do to a mat world. As more organisms disturb the carpet, the stable, sticky surfaces that favored quilts disappeared. New animals, some soft, some beginning to armor up, tunneled for food and shelter and mixed oxygen deeper into the sediment. Mixing sediments is wonderful for modern ocean health, but it is terrible for beings that need a smooth microbial canvas to sprawl. At the same time, climate and chemistry were shifting. Rising oxygen in many places lifted the metabolic ceiling, allowing bodies to invest in collagen, muscle, and eventually minerals like calcite and phosphate. In Namibia and other sites, tubes such as Cludina and little cup-shaped Namacalathus appear late in the Ediacaran, and some Cludina tubes bear round holes that match the profile of attack. Predation is not a villain in this story. It is a feedback that encourages armor and mobility. Once hard parts pay for themselves, they cascade through ecosystems, opening new jobs for grazers, crushers, and filterers. If you need a date for the handoff, the formal boundary sits at 541 million years ago, where a small fossil called Treptichnus, really a complex burrow, announces a new style of life. The Cambrian Explosion that follows is less a single bang than a long fuse sped up by that new budget of oxygen and innovation. Standing on a bedding plane. Though, those summaries feel thin compared with the human reasons we are drawn to these fossils. Maya's sketchbook had filled with quiet experiments. She drew fronds not as plants, but as surfaces built to bargain with water. She drew Dickinsonia as a living conveyor adding modules at one end, and she shaded the mat beneath it as if the very floor were alive. She even drew a blank square, a little memorial to the ones that were stepped on or stolen before care and policy arrived. Aiden placed his hand next to hers on the cast and said, "It's wild that rocks can change your job and your heart at the same time." Lena grinned and replied that rocks mostly change your patience, and then, if you're lucky, your questions. Yet endings are only half the truth. Many themes the Ediacaran invented continue inside us, using large surface areas to trade with the environment, building with repeated modules, and letting simple rules create elaborate forms. Even our collagen, the rope that lets animal bodies hold together, benefits from oxygen that first crept upward long before backbones or brains. I carry that idea to classrooms across the country. When a student asks whether these creatures are our ancestors, I say some may be cousins and others distant neighbors. But all of them are part of the neighborhood that made us possible. I tell them that biology is not a story of winners and losers. It's a story of experiments and context. An oval that thrives on a mat is not a failure next to a crab with claws. It is a solution to a different problem, The wonder is that Earth held both worlds in sequence. Guides led us in a small thank you ritual that the park hosts. We spoke aloud one question we would keep working on. Aiden asked how the community could balance tourism with protection. Maya asked how to draw movement without muscles. Lena asked how to tell this story without forcing these organisms into modern boxes. Mine was simple. How can I help audiences feel comfortable with uncertainty? We packed our socks and casts, left the bedding plain cleaner than we found it, and walked back through heath colored red by tiny plants that outlived continents. In the airport, Maya showed me the piece she would take home to her gallery. It was a triptych. The first panel showed a calm meadow of fronds. The second showed grazing scratches and drifting quilts. The third glowed with small tubes and a line of burrows snaking across the sand. Down the margin she wrote 3 sentences that she wanted viewers to read like tide pools repeating in a shoreline. Notice the pattern, follow the process, honor the place. I asked permission to borrow that for my talks. She laughed and said the sea wrote it, not me. If you are watching this at home, far from Newfoundland or Namibia, there is still a way to stand on these sea floors. Hold a blanket and spread it on your living room floor. See how it smooths irregularities, how it invites you to lie down and take up space. Now imagine someone tugging the corners, rolling it, wrinkling it, and finally replacing it with a rug that resists stains and scuffs. The Ediacaran world loved blankets, and the Cambrian loved rugs and tiles. We descend from the rug and tile society, but we carry the memory of blankets in our cells. When you breathe, when you move, when collagen binds you together, you are spending oxygen that quilts first taught the planet to use. The wonder is not that the quilts vanished, but that they left behind enough of their pattern for us to recognize ourselves in it. So the next time you see a rock slab in a museum, look not for faces but for rhythm. Let uncertainty be a tutor, not a threat. And remember that even the strangest lives are part of our shared biography, a long experiment in being alive on a changing earth. If this story moved you, carry its lessons outward, notice patterns, follow processes, and honor places. They are our best tools for meeting the futures we have yet to imagine, and for meeting them with tenderness and awe. Some researchers also point to swings in nutrients and carbon cycling near the period's end. Carbon isotope curves wobble worldwide, hinting at altered oceans and food webs. The details are debated, but the takeaway is simple. Conditions shifted. When blankets lost their stable mats and the water's chemistry changed, quilts yielded to burrowers and builders. And the stage was set for the Cambrian's ignition.